All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you sit in this world, since we have participants from all over the world today. My name is Thomas Renard, and I am the director of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT. I joined this prestigious institution in September, and I am very glad to be able to chair this annual conference today and tomorrow, which features many high-level speakers and gives us a chance to share some of our key achievements of this year with all of you. I am happy to see so many registered participants for this event, which is also live streamed on YouTube, and I hope that you will enjoy this conversation. So please sit down and relax. Make yourself at home, I'd be tempted to say, although probably many of you are indeed at home. And I'm delighted to pass on the floor now to Alex von Hoosenbach, who has been interim director of ICCT for most of this year, and certainly for a longer time than I have been director of this institution, and who will introduce you to ICCT and to our first speaker. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, for that, and as well, hearty welcome to all of our esteemed guests and speakers here today. It's quite a pleasure to be able to bring this event to you. I do want to make a note from the outset that, of course, we are happy that you all followed us into this virtual setting. We were very hopeful that we would be able to meet some of you, at least in person here in The Hague, but we do hope that in 2022, we find ourselves in better times and have the opportunity for an annual conference that at least involves in some way, shape, or form a chance to meet for those who are in The Hague or the Netherlands or its orbit. As Thomas said, my name is Alexander von Rosenbach. I am very proud to have served at ICCT in various leadership roles for the last 3 years, in particular for the last 15 months prior to Thomas's joining in September as the interim director. And I currently now serve as Thomas's deputy in the role of ICCT business manager. And it's with that experience that I'm very happy to introduce you a little bit more to ICCT. I think many of you perhaps know us well for one piece of our work or the other, or perhaps a particular channel or a publication that you particularly love. But I think it's important to introduce you to the broader organization as part of this annual conference. And I think the best place to start is really where we began. So we were founded, ICCT, 11 years ago, around a single conviction, and that is that long-term security is best achieved through counterterrorism policy and counterterrorism practice that is grounded in human rights and the rule of law. We know, I think, all of us who have worked in this field for any, whether it's a few weeks or a lifetime, what failure looks like when we don't try to uphold those standards. We've seen it in the quarters of Abu Ghraib. We know what it looks like in the destruction of cities like Aleppo or other places. We consistently, unfortunately, hear reports and see the documented violations of human rights and the rule of law by security forces around the world, often in the name of security. And it's important to also acknowledge that before we get too comfortable here in Europe, we also have challenges here at home. There are, for example, and just to list a couple, many unresolved challenges about how we deal with returning foreign terrorists and their fighters. What are the moral, ethical, legal, and security considerations around those individuals? And of course, we are particularly in the COVID era, grappling with the right to freedom of speech in comparison with the rising tide of hatred that we see in the online space, both focused on Islamic communities and also on right-wing extremism and other anti-government forces and forces that polarize our communities. And I think amidst all of this, ICCT pursues what I think is a fairly simple and three-pronged mission. Number one, we attempt to broaden the evidence base, to strengthen the evidence base behind this conviction. We believe that an evidence-based approach, whether in policy or practice, is the essential ingredient and the essential starting point. The second thing that we do is we try to share what we learn So we share that through events like these, through smaller workshops in the international forum that we work with in the UN, in the GCTF, in Brussels and the like, also in the international media, through our own publications, for instance, the ICCT journal, or our new podcast, or whatever the channel is that we think is most effective to reach quite a diverse audience as we have here today. And the third thing that we do is we really try to drive adoption. And I think this is perhaps it is not the most important part of our work, but I think it is really critical. And most importantly, I think it's actually less well advertised, frankly, as part of ICCT's portfolio of work, and that we try to drive adoption by working with global policymakers and practitioners, with regional individuals, and also really at ground level in the field where there is frontline work to be done. And that involves quite a different set of skills depending on which challenge or which community you're working with. And over the last 11 years, that has taken us into many different corners of the world. We have worked with victims of terrorism in Indonesia to help them become messengers for peace and counter-radicalization in schools and in communities. We've worked shoulder to shoulder with prison staff in Mali, in the Western Balkans, in Pakistan, and beyond, to strengthen national capacities to manage violent extremist offenders. We've worked on community resilience in Nigeria, bringing security forces and civil society organizations together, working with traditional authorities in Burkina Faso and other parts of West Africa. And we have, frankly, also engaged with vulnerable communities closer to home, for instance, just down the road in Utrecht or in other places across the European continent. And I think it would be also fair to say that we have sat at the table in many important sessions in New York. We have paced the corridors of Brussels and in Belgium, trying to work with our EU partners. We've negotiated alongside and facilitated conversations in the GCTF to help and forge important memorandum, recommendations, and other global policy frameworks. And this in itself is, I think, quite an accomplishment for a relatively small organization in quite a broad and global field. So I'm quite proud of all the staff who have done this work over the last, certainly in my tenure in 3 years, but obviously going back to the full history of the organization. And I think it's also important to understand that we have been doing all of this sort of more hands-on work while continuing to push forward with a strong research product, publishing major works on foreign terrorist fighters, on right-wing extremism. And I think we're particularly proud to house now the Handbook of Terrorism Prevention and Preparedness, which was published over the course of last year and this year under the very wise guidance of Professor Emeritus Alex P. Schmidt. That is really some of the work that we are perhaps most proud of and look forward to continuing in the future. But I think there's also, before I hand over the microphone, an important story to tell here in this setting about ICCT's own internal journey towards where we find ourselves today, which gives us a good sense of what comes in the next chapter of our organization's lifespan. From 2010 until 2020, ICCT was a project-based collaboration delivered through cooperation between 3 Dutch founding partners, and that was the TMC Asser Institute, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University, and the Klingendal Institute. And we were very proud and happy to work within and amongst those partners. But over the last few years in particular, those institutions and ICCT staff have worked hard together to chart a new course for ICCT. And by that new course, I mean in 2021, ICCT became formally established as its own new independent nonprofit organization, formally joining what we are quite excited to be part of as a rich community of peace and justice organizations based here in The Hague. In that context, we continue to recognize Asser and ISKE as our founding partners, and we also continue to strengthen our partnership with the CT and PCB community, both here in the Netherlands and much more in the global community. ICCT now has a leading role in the European Commission's Radicalization Awareness Policy Support Program, and continues to support closely the GCTF's criminal justice and rule of law working groups, and is engaged with the United Nations, with NATO, and with other intergovernmental organizations working in this space. Additionally, we continue to work closely with national governments in Europe, North America, further afield. And of course, we are pleased that ICCT in its new form has continued to build on its long-standing partnership with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism. And I think on that note, it is perhaps appropriate to hand over the floor to Huib Mijnarends, who currently serves as the Counterterrorism Special Envoy of the Netherlands, as well as the head of the Counterterrorism and National Security Division at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before assuming this role, Huib held several other positions at the MFA in The Hague here, as well as the Dutch Embassy in Caracas and the Dutch representations to the UN in New York and to the EU in Brussels. He furthermore served as a political advisor in Afghanistan and has spent 2 years in Berlin as a policy officer seconded to the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the last few years, we've had the pleasure of having many a meeting and some interesting conversations about the role and the space for ICCT, and we look forward to hearing his opening remarks here. Huib, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for those warm words. Also, thanks to Thomas for having us here in this session. And let me start by saying that how proud we are also as Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the achievements reached by ICCT. And there's still a great way ahead of you all. And I hope we can do that in close cooperation. I think from our sides, maybe a few remarks before the kickoff of today's discussion on trends in radicalization to violence. I'm pretty sure that this discussion will also provide us with some great insights. ICCT annual conference for us comes at a timely moment. This year, 20 years after 9/11, I think is a good time for reflection on our collective efforts to counter and prevent terrorism and the spread of violent extremism. And let me start by reflecting on some of our international efforts and challenges. We've seen significant step forwards. Sometimes that needs to be said as well. And notably, ISIS has lost most of its territory in Syria and Iraq, territorially defeated, though they're still very much there. And financing and economic infrastructure of terrorist organizations are often tackled successfully. We can and should be proud of that. At the same time, the terrorist threat is far from over and has become more diverse, diffuse, and decentralized than ever before. Transnational terrorist organizations and networks are more loosely affiliated, efficiently use the internet, making them increasingly difficult to predict, track, and counter. And therefore, an up-to-date international response is very much needed, and this is precisely what the newly updated UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy aims to do. And this updated strategy, adopted by the GA this year, reflects a comprehensive approach to preventing and countering terrorism. It pays attention to the use of new technologies by violent extremists and gives warning to the rise, for instance, right-wing extremist groups pose to society. But more importantly, it takes into account the lessons learned over the past years and shows the commitment of the international community to stay ahead of the curve in its response to terrorism. But the strategy in the end is just a piece of paper and needs us and member states, organizations, including civil society, to effectively implement the measures we have agreed upon. And we're not there yet. There are still many challenges that lay ahead, and there are many lessons to be drawn. The recent takeover by the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example. Although it's probably too early to tell what Taliban rule exactly will bring to Afghanistan, the international community made it clear that Afghanistan cannot turn into a safe haven for terrorist organizations once again. And recent terrorist attacks by ISKP are very worrisome in that regard, and we have to come up with an answer how best to deal with this growing threat. Another worrying development as well is that the Taliban overtaking of Afghanistan inspires other extremist groups around the world, most notably in the Sahel and West Africa. And already ISIS and Al-Qaeda and a spate of affiliated extremist groups are rapidly gaining ground in that vulnerable region. And for the Netherlands and this Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the spillover from the Sahel to the West African coastal states is especially a dangerous trend to the Netherlands. And we will organize an international conference to discuss with partners and countries concerned how best to deal with that. It is, of course, appealing to respond to terrorist acts with hard CT measures alone. But if you really truly want to counter violent extremism and terrorism in the long run, the approach needs to be inclusive of civil society and respectful of human rights. And we need to acknowledge the vital role that civil society and organizations, such as ICCT, play in supporting the most vulnerable in society and those who are targeted by extremist narratives. And without CSO inclusion, an effective CT policy is simply impossible. And once again, in this regard, we're very proud to be a great supporter and host country of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. The center plays for us a unique role in doing research and bringing practical, solution-oriented implementation support. And it also systematically conveys the message we truly believe in, and Alex already said it, the human rights and rule of law-based approach to preventing and countering terrorism. I very much look forward to today's discussion and welcome more of ICT Good's work in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huib. I will not stand too much longer between all of you and our keynote speakers and panel today, but I did just want to make then 2 short closing remarks before we let the main event happen. The first is very quick to note that we have also, as part of the event today, prepared an e-magazine featuring some of ICCT's work over the recent years, introducing you to some of its staff and giving you a sense of the key research priorities that we intend to continue prioritizing over the next few years. That magazine will be submitted to you in your inboxes as part of the conclusion of this conference. So do take a look at it and find us in those different channels as you do. The second remark is a little bit more personal, and that is to say that, we had, as I said at the beginning, hope to welcome many of you to ICCT's premises to mostly get to know a little bit ICCT staff after several years of being faces on screens and the like. And frankly, it has been my deep pleasure over the last few years to work very closely with and in partnership with what I think is quite an amazing staff here at ICCT. They are, without intending to over cliche, they're really the heart and the soul of this organization. And what they do, what we ask of them, is quite challenging. We ask for this high quality research skill. We ask them to be politically tactful. We ask them to be able to go into the field, get their sleeves rolled up and get their hands dirty. And that is not an easy ask. It is also one that I have seen every single individual on this organization step up to willingly, with passion, and with a deep commitment to make ICCT what it is today. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm a little bit sad that we don't have the opportunity to introduce you to them in person. So what I wanted to do, and this is what we are doing over the course of today, is to show you a few short videos that get a little bit more, I guess, familiar with the key folks within our organization, explaining their work. And I think you then a little bit get to see them, hear their passion, and hopefully connect with the work that they do in a different way than you have in other settings. So we're really excited to launch these. They're just short, a minute or two each, but just a little bit insight into who folks are and why we are very proud to work at the ICCT. So I think that's our cue here to fire up the video, and that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Tanja Mera is a Senior Research Fellow and Program Lead Rule of Law Responses to Terrorism. Tanja, it's been 2 decades since 9/11 and government counterterrorism policies changed quite a bit. Can you tell us the main purpose of your program?
So the main purpose of my program is Rule of Law Responses to Terrorism. And what this means is that we really try to focus and look at countering terrorism and violent extremism through a rule of law angle. And what you've seen actually in the past 2 decades is that many of the counterterrorism measures have negatively impacted human rights. And rule of law, it's not a political concept, it's not a moral concept, but it is a practical concept. It's an important prerequisite to effective countering terrorism and violent extremism. So it's at the heart of how you want to address these issues.
And which topics do you think will feature prominently throughout 2022 in relation to the theme radicalization to violence?
So I think what you're going to see is different aspects. One is what we're going to see, there's going to be more polarization in society, but what we also are going to see is the administrative measures are going to be expanded and be used also in different areas than only jihadism. It would probably also be used in the context of right-wing extremism and other forms of violent extremism. What we probably also are going to see is a further increase of moving into the pre-criminal space. And this can have a negative impact on human rights. And finally, what I see as a trend, and I think that's a positive trend, is that there are now more and more countries who are exploring prosecuting alleged terrorists for the full range of crimes they have committed. So not just for terrorist offenses, not just for membership of terrorist organizations, but for the actual crimes that they have committed there, which could range from depriving a child of water. This could range from sexual gender-based violence crimes to many other crimes that have been committed.
Thank you for taking the time for talking about your program.
All right, so there you have met our colleague Tanya Mera, and you will meet a few other of our colleagues in the course of this conference today and tomorrow. Now time has come to move on to our panel, and I'm very glad to be able to moderate this discussion now with three distinguished panelists, which I will introduce in just a second, just to give everyone a bit of the choreography here. We are now heading for 45 minutes of conversation within the panel, which will then be followed by a Q&A session. So you will all have a chance to ask questions. There is a little Q&A tool there in the Zoom that you can go to and ask questions. You can also vote on the questions that other people have posed, and you can already do that while we are having this conversation. We also wanted to engage or give you all a chance to engage with us and with the speakers. So also throughout this conversation, you will have a few polls that will be activated through the chat, and I will flag this out to you in due course, of course. But you will have a chance also to share your views or your thoughts on some important topics. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our three distinguished panelists. First, we have Michèle Coninsx. Michèle Coninsx is the Executive Director of the UN Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, UNCTAD. And previously, Ms. Coninsx served as President of Eurojust and as Chair of Eurojust Counter-Terrorism team, and before that she was also a public prosecutor working in the Public Prosecutor's Office in Brussels. Our second distinguished panelist is Pieter-Jaap Aalbersberg, who is the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Security in the Netherlands and CTV. He has a long career within the Dutch police. He was previously Chief Constable of the Amsterdam Regional Unit, and has also among many other positions, held a position as within Interpol's Executive Committee. And last but not least, we have with us also Dr. Christiane Hoehn, who is the Principal Advisor to the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator, for whom she has worked since 2010. And prior to joining the Council of the European Union in 2004, Dr. Hoehn was a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for International Law in Heidelberg, Germany, and an affiliate at the Center for Public Leadership, Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to the three of you, and I'm very glad that we are having this conversation with you. My first question will be to Michèle Coninsx. There are many challenges that need to be addressed with regard to violent extremism, and this is part of the mandate of UNCTAD to look at some of these trends. So what can you tell us about the main threats or risks that you see on the horizon at the global level?
Good day to all of you, and many thanks to you, Director Renard, for this invitation to this high-level debate, and to see good friends back on the screen. If you really look ahead of what the trends we may face over the horizon, it's important to ensure that we have a good understanding of the current threats and challenges. And I must admit that on the 4th of November, we commemorated the 20 years of existence of Security Council Resolution 1373, and look back on the evolution of terrorism and violent extremism over the years. So it gave us a good momentum, not only to look back, to stand still where we are, but that also was an opportunity to look ahead, to look into the future and future threats. And what we have seen is that terrorism has exacerbated some of the world's most critical environmental, security, and humanitarian challenges. And one of the most pressing current challenges, and it has already been alluded to, is definitely the COVID-19 pandemic. It has exacerbated many of the trends we already faced, including by increasing insecurity in some regions of the world, but we also see that the profound social, economic, and political consequences, the perpetuation of inequalities, polarization, and unrest for many years to come will be one of our main concerns. So those challenges will remain. They exacerbate, increase already existing and identified trends. And as we all know, we just alluded to, we were not able to meet with your talented team and the center, but the pandemic has forced all of us to make of our offices, our home offices, our offices, to be disconnected with a lot of core players. But it also has put a lot of attention to the increased risk that individuals will become radicalized to violence and decided to commit acts of violence from their home office, as they all homes as such, as they all massively made use of the online possibilities. And this threat is particularly relevant in the context of what we call here at the United Nations not longer extreme right wing or far right, but terrorism motivated by xenophobia, racism, other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion and belief. The preponderance of lone actors is another layer of concern that both in this context and more broadly continues to present a fundamental challenge in terms of the state's ability to prevent and both respond to terrorism in a timely manner. We're also deeply concerned, and it has to be alluded to by Huib, by the potential impact of the situation of Afghanistan. We are not only extremely concerned by the humanitarian catastrophe, which must be addressed as a matter of urgency, but we also see that there is a risk of an increase of terrorism within Afghanistan as such. Was alluded to the number of attacks already claimed by ISIL KP, but also the potential for the country to be used as a safe haven to plan and to launch attacks in other countries. Also, in the light of foreign terrorist fighters, there might be an increased movement in and out of the country. Not to be neglected, the potential role that the current caretaker government can play in order to inspire other terrorist groups in countries where the government is already highly fragilized or fragile. We continue to witness also the vestiges of the ISIL occupation of territories in Iraq, both and Syria, even as ISIL continues to seek to regroup. It has already been alluded to, and it is alarming the continued existence of conditions which make these countries conducive to the spread of terrorism. Look at the camps, the Al-Rosh, Al-Hoehn camp, and the dire situations, especially in relation to very young children and females. We're deeply concerned at the continued increase in terrorist attacks in Africa, Sub-Saharan, Sahel, West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. No one has been spared. We also see more and more an obscure sort of an opportunity of alliance between terrorist groups, criminal groups, and armed groups, which makes the approach rather complex and complicated. And we also see that those groups increasingly are attracting recruits and financing from across the borders. There are just a few of the current challenges that likely will remain a concern in the coming months and years. And that combined with, of course, the global geopolitical dynamics, but also the never-stopping technological developments means that there is no reason at all to not stay alert and vigilant in the coming years.
Thank you very much. You may have heard in the background at one point a little bell. So when you are reaching the end of the time that is given for every speaker, you might hear this little bell that indicates that it's time to conclude your intervention. Mr. Aalbersberg, you are in charge of a national service whose task is to monitor terrorism and violent extremism. So from your point of view, from your corner at the national level, what do you see as the main threats or risk on the horizon?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for inviting me on this platform. And then, of course, I will repeat part of our main job is 3 times a year we bring out our threat assessment document. And for all the followers, you can find that on the internet on nctv.nl, where our products are started. And to summarize, I think the last number 55 of a threat assessment document shows that still the main threat in the Netherlands is jihadistic violence carried out by a lone actor or a small group. And that can be influenced coming year by the process of still the returnees coming out of the area, and also the end of the detention of the first group of convicted people on terrorist attacks. So there are 2 of the patterns in that. But I think in this small presentation, however, I will more move to the risk of right-wing extremism terrorist attack in the Netherlands, which is also conceivable. This threat in the Netherlands is mainly based on the involvement of more and more young Dutch people in the international online accelerists networks. Adherents of this ideology seek to use terrorist violence in the communities to hasten a race war in order to establish a white ethno-state. The security service in the Netherlands have repeatedly warned that Dutch youngsters with troubled backgrounds may feel attracted to the growing international right-wing extremist network world. And I think the main concerns are that the recent developments in the more obscure and secluded areas of the internet. The new generation of youngsters have grown up with this internet, have grown up with game culture, all this kind of communications app, and they have increasingly shifted their activities from the major social media platforms to alternative platforms with less regulation. Terrorist attacks abroad shows that right-wing extremism can turn into terrorism, and a lone actor committing an attack in the Netherlands is deemed as possibility, and therefore slowly an equal threat in the Netherlands in our threat assessment document, which is still 3 out of 5 against threats. These developments have the attention of the Dutch government and are being tackled at various levels. EU regulation, for example, can help in countering the distribution of terrorist content online. If you look a little bit broader, I think maybe we can see that the appearances of radicalization, extremism, and terrorism are changing a little bit from the traditional organized, structured, ideology-driven groups, much more to an online community, sometimes organized, but also some like as a mass group organizing itself, which individuals, sometimes weak people, can radicalize in a very short moment. In an ad hoc ideology, where they just put things from internet in their own made ideology. And that's a new trend in terrorism, where also is a new challenge for to identify, and also a challenge for us, how do we regulate this kind of platforms in the future on internet? And then finally, one of the issues already mentioned by the previous speakers, also polarization in the Netherlands, in the country, can be an influence on the future on radicalization and extremism. Sometimes now by Corona, but also maybe in the future on the climate questions, because the polarization quickly also can move people in radicalization patterns. Therefore, radicalization patterns in the new way of internet, in the flash mobs-like world, is one of the tensions I think we have to talk about in the future cooperation together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aalbersberg. Dr. Hoehn, you are the principal advisor to the EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, Ilka Salmi, and the EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator has become a central figure now at the European level, with a panoptic view on internal and external challenges to the EU. What can you tell us about the main threats or risk on the horizon from Europe's point of view?
Thank you so much, Thomas. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here, because I was already working with ICCT from its beginning. And it's really amazing to see how this has developed. And I've been at many of your events, and I can just underline how important your research has been to us over the years, and not only research, but also being involved in projects. So thanks a lot also for all the support this institute has given to the work of our office and of the EU and internationally more broadly. Now, on the threat, the terrorist threat in the EU remains high. In large parts, the Europol counts 21 people killed in terrorist attacks last year, and there were in total 57 completed, failed or failed terrorist attacks. What we've seen in terms of COVID, the short-term impact on the terrorist threat as such has been limited, but what we are watching now is the violence coming out of it, as was already mentioned. And we don't see any diminishing of the threat in 2021. As Huib has already said, it has become more complex, more diverse. In Europe, Al-Qaeda and Daesh-related terrorism remains the major threat, and the vast majority of the deadly attacks and victims was from Islamist terrorist attacks. But we do see that right-wing violent extremism and terrorism is rising. The problems are, Michèle mentioned it, the legacy of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. The foreign fighters in the family still there, a ticking time bomb for radicalization with the children. There might also be the risk in the future in case there are prison breaks. We see some sort of a resurgence of Daesh in Syria and Iraq. And of course, they are still very strong online and have affiliates around the world. Al-Qaeda, we are concerned indeed about Afghanistan. At the moment, it's not assessed to raise the threat in the EU right way, but of course we need to be vigilant and also see the impact more globally, and we have to avoid this becoming a new safe haven for Al-Qaeda. We're watching the Africanization of terrorists, so to say, so the increasing threat in Africa that Michèle also mentioned. And in Europe, you see a lot, when you look at the actors that were responsible for the terrorist attacks, you see homegrown actors, lone actors in Europe. Most of them had consumed terrorist propaganda on the internet. In terms of Daesh, they were inspired by Daesh, but not directed. So that has changed from the last couple of years. And also there seems to be an increasing trend of terrorists acting out of what you could call misguided religious fervor for what they call blasphemous acts without any clear identification of terrorist groups. And also we see some attackers with mental health issues. Now, violent right-wing extremism and terrorism is on the rise, as Mr. Aalbersberg has said. In one of the member states, at least, it's regarded as a higher threat than Islamist terrorism. What we see about the scene in Europe, the right-wing violent extremist scene, it's fragmented, it's leaderless, without hierarchically organized organizations that are driving terrorist attacks. But Mr. Aalbersberg already said the online dimension and connecting is very strong. And we've also started to watch the left-wing violent extremism and terrorism. The terrorist attacks to date were kind of simple in execution in Europe, knives, firearms, explosives. But of course, we need to watch in the future that the threat could come from new technologies. And that's, for example, why we are working on drones already. And so in sum up, what I can say is that we have reduced vulnerabilities because we increased a lot our response, but we are not yet winning because when you look out there, there are still many people radicalizing, many persons belonging to terrorist groups. So we still need to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoehn. I note quite a degree of convergence in the threat assessment between the three of you, which is probably a good sign between the national level, the European level, and the global level, that we do look at things in a relatively similar manner. I would like to take this opportunity to open up the first Menti poll. So in the chat, the team will post a link that everyone in the audience you can follow, and it will ask you what you all see as the main threats on the horizon. So we will see also whether you see and whether you agree with our panelists. Meanwhile, in this panel, we do not want, of course, to look only at the threats, but also at the counterterrorism responses that have been or that are being put in place. So from the UN point of view, Mrs. Coninsx, what are the main counterterrorism and counter-extremism priorities for 2022? What are the key achievements planned at the UN level for the coming year?
Thank you. CITAT is currently undergoing its mandate renewal. So the exact direction of the work for 2022 remains unclear. But however, we anticipate that the renewed mandate will encourage CITAT to continue working on a broad range of priorities in 2022 and beyond. We will first and foremost continue to assist the Security Council Committee in conducting neutral, even-handed, objective and independent, as I said, expert assessments, which are really an ongoing dialogue with the member states, where we do not only address the threats, but also the risks, the responses, the fragilities and the challenges encountered by the member states, a whole spectrum array of issues. That coupled with our role as facilitator of the delivery of technical assistance based on the recommendations highly supported by the visited member states and the Security Council, and having the weight of the Security Council. And finally, also couple all these findings with ongoing analytical work with the research community on terrorist issues, trends and developments. And that's all of this a goldmine of information. We of course also do contribute to the work of other UN entities like to the Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, with a lot of entities involved. And we of course ensure that the counterterrorism and CVE efforts encompass a broad range of thematic issues across all regions, with the determination to enhance international, regional and national cooperation at their heart. If you look at priorities, I would say that CFT, the countering and financing of terrorism, is important. Technology enabled terrorism offenses, and that becomes the hull of a challenge as such. More effective mechanisms for screening, prosecution, rehabilitation and reintegration, especially related to the problem of foreign terrorist fighters, and placing the victims and the survivors of terrorism at the heart of our activities and initiatives to effort to promote justice, to ensure that the humanitarian needs are being accommodated and appropriate support is being delivered. That coupled with full respect of international human rights law and of course at all moments gender and an age-sensitive approach is vital now and in the future. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Aalbersberg, from NZF's point of view, what are the main counterterrorism and counter-extremism priorities for 2022? What is it that you aim to achieve next year?
Well, basically, there's not a big change in the last year. So it's further building on what we already have developed and to intensify our counterterrorism policy we already had. Investments are still made, among the other things, in the intelligence capacity, but also the technology intelligence capacity, the criminal justice chain, in prevention and international cooperation, which I will elaborate a little bit later on. In our policy, continuous effort is made to support the local approach, because the local approach in the Netherlands is the fundamental basic of the whole approach. Crucial in reducing the threats that can emanate from extremist persons. It's essential on local level that signals of radicalization, possible threats are recognized early in good time and properly interpreted so that targeting efforts can be made to counteract them. That local integrated approach to radicalization, extremism and terrorism is the means to gain insight into the local problem and subsequently intervene at local level, and therefore to strengthen the municipalities with knowledge, it seems is one of our priorities also for coming year. As I already told, we also have to be prepared on the end of detention of the first wave of convicted terrorist criminals, but also still, as already also been mentioned by the other speakers, the returnees. And that's not only in the Netherlands itself, that's also in the Schengen area and the European area. And therefore, I think it's to strengthen the cooperation, to exchange information is also one of the priorities for coming periods. Then again, following the assessment, the new developments on the right-wing terrorism certainly ask us for new priorities. As I said, those youngsters who are more and more quickly radicalization on the internet are very young, sometimes even between 12 and 21, the main groups, which is really a concern. And the concern for us is how can we identify them earlier, but also how can we get them out of those internet bubbles instead of waiting till they are in the position of crimes and in the whole criminal system. So this whole thing about prevention is, I think, one of the big priorities for coming year. Also on the international cooperation, and it's already said, I think, in the whole developing of the content online authorities in Europe, we already made a step. But we really have developed those steps also to the deeper layers of internet. What are we going to do in Europe on those new elaboration of threats and radicalization on the right wing? I think that are the main priorities. So building and strengthening what we already have had, basically the local approach, more and more getting knowledge in deep what's happening in the deeper layers of internet with those youngsters. How can we identify them and can we get them out of those internet bubbles before they really radicalize? And that also means in Europe and international aspect, still a lot of cooperation, because without cooperation on terrorism, we cannot fulfill our priorities.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hoehn, same question to you, really. From the EU's point of view, what are the main counterterrorism and counter-extremism priorities for next year? What are the key achievements planned at the EU level for the next year?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Aalbersberg already said very well that we will deepen and strengthen our work on a whole range of fronts. The same is true for the EU. You might recall that in 2015, after the attacks Charlie Hebdo, the heads of state and government gave a vision that the EU should act in three, let's say, baskets: security in the narrow sense and border security, information sharing, the second, prevention of radicalization and safeguarding of values, and the third one, cooperation with third countries. And that is exactly what we continue to do. Now, last year, the Commission updated the Security Union strategy. They also in December issued a counterterrorism agenda. So all this is an ambitious program in all these fronts. Let me quickly tell you within that the priorities of the EU counterterrorism coordinator, which are 4. First one is the implementation of the Afghanistan action plan. Now, I said the EU wants to be vigilant and take action now to avoid that Afghanistan is becoming a greater terrorist threat for the EU, but also more internationally. What do we do? 4 work strands. The first one is, and that's linked to something Mr. Aalbersberg has said, we need to make sure that there are no infiltration of terrorists into the EU, into the Schengen space. So we need to, on the one hand, make sure that our databases are fed with information, for example, information coming from Afghanistan, people released there, people that might have been evacuated also elsewhere. Then that we do good security checks of people coming in. We have adopted a protocol which systematizes a bit among the member states. We are also engaging in the Western Balkans because there are a number of persons evacuated there. So that's the first kind of area of work. The second one, and that's where Michèle comes in, it's more internationally strategic intelligence to avoid that Afghanistan is becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. There are interesting reports by the UN monitoring mechanism, and we need to share information and do what we can to avoid that. Third one, it was mentioned before that it does not inspire terrorist groups in other areas such as Africa, the Sahel. So we need to monitor the online space and look at the Islamist extremism. And the last one, the terrorist financing, the drugs, etc. We need to watch that. Second priority for Ilka Salmi is prevention and addressing the ideologies also directly. So it's on the one hand, right-wing, left-wing. On right-wing, the Council has adopted a number of work strands, such as online. Left-wing, we're starting to look into, but also Islamist extremist ideology, aspect of radicalization we had worked on less in the past, but which is an issue not only for radicalization, but also integration and foreign influence. And there we have started an evidence-based dialogue with a number of partners, such as in the Gulf, which we will continue. And also we are strengthening our own knowledge and evidence base. Third topic is the camps and prisons in northeast Syria. The EU is not working on repatriations, that is only for the member states, but we have agreed some common approach to improve the conditions on the ground, in the camps, in the prisons, help with the children, and also underpin the UN's work that's trying to move families back to Iraq, so we could support this and reintegration in Syria as well. And the last point, and that's a big one, it's the new technologies and counterterrorism. On the one hand, it's the online space. Today is the ministerial meeting with the internet companies, so that is important. We need to work not only on removal of content, but also algorithmic amplification, which leads to the polarization that we have already here discussed. We've started also to look at online gaming, and there are a number of legislations on the table in the EU that we need to work on that are relevant for radicalization, such as the Digital Services Act, but also implementation of the terrorist content online. We also need to work, Mr. Aalbersberg said it, on the information sharing environment. Now, in the past, it was a lot, the focus was a lot on sharing. Now it's also a lot on collecting the information. We have issues related to data retention, encryption, e-evidence, battlefield information, and also information analysis, because some people say it's a tsunami of information. So we need to use new technologies, artificial intelligence, to deal with that. And then we need to strengthen the EU agencies in this context. Here in The Hague, we have created an innovation hub at Europol, where they should look at what is the new threats from the technology, but also have pilot projects. How can we develop tools to use them for internal security? And we are also updating the mandate of Europol and looking at artificial intelligence legislation. And all this is underpinned by the debate on privacy and security, where we believe that the security voice needs to be strengthened. So those are the priorities. But to wrap up, We do a lot of other things, of course, in the EU as well. So not only on work on foreign fighters, but also what the Germans call Gefährder, people who are radicalized at home, which are the ones that we should enter into the EU database. What's the threshold? Do you add 500? Do you add 20,000? I mean, that's a discussion going on. And also, we try to do a lot internationally to step up our assistance there. It has gone from one project to several hundred millions, and we work so closely also with the UN, UNOCT, CTED, but also GCTF and others. Thank you, Thomas. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Christiane. As a last round of question, or before the last round of question, I would like to ask for a second opportunity for a mentee to take the pulse a bit of the audience. So there will be another short poll that will be posted in the chat. So please feel free to fill that very quickly, and we will share the results at the end of this conversation. But as a last round of question, before opening the floor to the audience for the questions and answer session, I would like to put forward a perhaps slightly more philosophical question to each member of this panel, and also a different question for each member of this panel. And to you, Mrs. Coninsx, since counterterrorism has been a core item on the UN agenda for the past 20 years, I would like to ask you how you have come to define counterterrorism success at the UN.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Renard. In fact, I feel very privileged as I've been working more than 30 years at all levels, local, national, regional, and global level now in countering terrorism. And to be very honest, I've never seen a landscape, a terrorist landscape that is as complex and complicated as the one we are faced with right now, with an intersection with a broad range of policy issues. So the success in countering terrorism is more of a journey than a destination. And I think that if we want to be successful, we have to be successful at all those layers, local, national, regional, and global level. And not only looking at our responses to current threats, but also be focusing on preparedness, proactivity, prevention, and enabling ourselves to address the gaps in our abilities to respond to future challenges. So to be proactive, which is a word we use quite often, but really is extremely important in this context. And central to all these is delivering of enhanced counterterrorism, cooperation, and cooperation, coordination, partnerships are the keywords. And again, at national level, local level, regional level, and global level. The UN efforts focus on the delivery of a capacity building and technical assistance in all the member states, and especially those most impacted by terrorism, the high risk and the low capacity countries. And we really have to ensure that we take care of the security chain and focus on the weakest links in our counterterrorism change. And that means that the work of CTAD is really the foundation, is the basis for the success of all the rest. If we take on board the recommendations, the high priority needs and gaps and recommendations, and liaise with the implementing partners, the donor states, and get engaged in full coordination, focus and target on those priority needs, we will be able to up-level that security change. And that is exactly what we are currently trying to achieve. And then, as we all know, we need a whole of society and a whole of government approach where all layers of society have an equal role to play. If we don't respect the human rights, we are off the game and will not be successful. Everything we do must be evidence-based, so hence the importance of our dialogue coupled to the research activity. And we need to, and more than ever, because of the numbers and the differences in gender, be gender sensitive, be age sensitive. The number of children being linked, connected to terrorism activity has never been that low, and also victim centered. So again, it's about coordination, cooperation, and partnership. All the players are equally important. Civil society as one of the important players, not in a very good situation right now because of COVID-19, which is certainly shrinking. their civic space. But I can't underline enough, Mr. Renard, we were collaborating with you in your previous job at the Egmont Institute, now in your current job at the ICCT. We have very good experiences with the 100 other research centers and institutes, and that has to continue, because that will contribute to the success in our preparedness and in our proactivity. So a lot to be done, but I'm sure that if we respect all of these, we will be one day successful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Aalbersberg, the threat landscape in most European countries is becoming more diverse and diffuse, not least with the rise of right-wing extremism, conspiracy theories, etc. It has been said in the course of this conversation. Now, the question to you is, should we use the same recipes to manage these threats than those we have developed to deal with jihadi terrorism over the past 2 decades? That is to say, should we use the same laws, the same prevention tools, etc.? Or do we need to develop an entirely new approach? And why is that?
Interesting question, and then only for a few minutes to answer. I'll do my best for that. First, we have to be careful with labeling. In your question was already the conspiracy theories. Activism is a part of democracy, and we have to put our labels in this way only on extremism, where violence is legitimated, and terrorism. Conspiracy theories always have been. Only COVID has worked like a kind of a contrast fluence and made it visible and temporarily connect some of the conspiracies, but I'm convinced that in time that will change a little bit. Then back to your question, I still think is that what we have developed the last years is the basic also for our approach in the right-wing extremism, etc. And most of the systems, the local approach, the intelligence services, police in connection to each other, the data exchange, national and international, but also the laws, etc., is also the basic in the Netherlands for our approach on right-wing extremism. But that, having said that, we have to adapt on some new patterns, and that will not be a total surprise following my earlier remarks. We have to adapt in the technology question. We also have adapt, and maybe that's also a question for ICCT, in studies to better understand what's happening online. How does those flash mobs movement international working? What we have to do with all those new patterns? And online and offline is getting more and more integrated. And what that means. So I'm not calling for a new approach. I still think is the approach we have developed is a very good approach. We have to use it, and we have to put it in place after COVID. In the Netherlands, really, because of the lockdowns, etc., we have to put the attention back where we were before COVID. But we have to adapt on technology. We have to adapt to content online, and also to better understand what have I said, what's happening in those online-offline combination. And that knowledge is not only for us international to share, but also to help local communities to build up their knowledge on those systems. We have put a lot of energy in the jihadistic terrorism in the Netherlands. There's a lot of local knowledge, but the new knowledge on the right-wing extremism, to recognize that, but also to deal on local level with the combination of online, offline is one, I think, of the new things we have to work out.
Thank you very much, and duly noted the invitation for more research on these topics, indeed, and tomorrow also we will explore more the research or the knowledge gaps that still need to be further explored. And also, of course, I could not resist noting the point by Michèle Coninsx on the importance of international networks between research institutes and policy-making world, also at the international level. And that is true that UNCTAD has played a very important role there, which is highly appreciated, hopefully on all sides. Now turning for the last question also to Christiane Hoehn. Over the past few years, the EU has become much more central to counterterrorism efforts in Europe. It has demonstrated, I believe, a real added value in this field. Now, do you think that this cooperation has now peaked? Is there a risk to see CT cooperation decrease in intensity? Is there a risk of counterterrorism fatigue, to quote your previous boss, Gilles de Kerchove, in light of the lower, albeit persistent threat and a certain national withdrawal, we could say, on or nationalism on security issues. And I would say here, I would like also to flag that the last mentee of this session will be posted in the chat related to that question. So I would ask my team to post the last mentee in the chat, and everyone feel free to fill it. And Christiane Hoehn, Christiane, I give you the floor.
Yeah, Thomas, thanks. Excellent question. And you've alluded to it. There's a sea change in EU counterterrorism action since 2015. I mean, I have seen it take off like never before. And the threat has not diminished. So the threat is still there. And also what I see is that we continue to make incremental progress to build stronger EU response, for example, legislation. I mean, there are a number of legislative acts on the table. We want to strengthen Europol. We are thinking of strengthening Eurojust. We have about the digital, the artificial intelligence, the DSA. So that all is incrementally going on. And we also constantly look at the evolving threat picture and see where do we need to adapt. What we also do is to see where do we need to take action early on. So Mr. Aalbersberg mentioned the prison leavers. That's something we are working on as well. We know, I mean, they have started to leave, but let's say 2 years ago, we knew they would be leaving. So we're already looking at that. The Afghanistan, the drones, etc. And also a lot of the broader policies that are taken in the justice and home affairs field, such as interoperability of databases, that is also important for CT. So we also see a lot of progress elsewhere that is helping CT. Now, on counterterrorism fatigue, as Gilles de Kerchove said, in the political sphere, what you have is that after an attack, the interest rises, as we could, for example, see in November after a string of attacks. And then the political, let's say, attention might then, go down a little bit for then another attack to rise again. But the work that all of us are doing, that is moving forward very, very steadily. I have not seen any stagnation and even less a decrease in cooperation in the EU context. And we are also a lot too interconnected for that. I mean, the terrorist groups, Mr. Aalbersberg said, in the Schengen space, all that is interconnected. There is the inherent need to work together. So I don't see a decrease. I don't even see a stagnation. I see a steady incremental process, even in times when there is not, let's say, the political highlight on it. But as we know, it can change from one day on the next. And what is important for us now is to continue to anticipate the new and emerging threats and to adapt the EU response to any types of terrorist attacks that might happen in the future. There's also, of course, cooperation outside the EU context. Mr. Aalbersberg also mentioned the security and intelligence services. Of course, that's outside the EU, but that has been the case also in the past. So this is not something new. So overall, I'm very positive. I know all this work that's going on. And also, I'm very glad to see that the EU is becoming a more important player in security, because when you look at the polls, the European citizens, I think 70–80%, they want the EU to play a stronger role. And I think the EU has understood that, the Commission has understood that, and we are building the security union now with many, let's say, incremental steps that then come together and make a stronger whole. Thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thank you very much. This concludes this first part of the conversation. Before we move on to questions and answers from the audience, I would like to see perhaps if we could see the results of the Menti. So this is the word cloud that was basically asking people what are the two main threats that they see for 2022. And we see here at the heart a lot of far right or right wing, but we also see a number of other issues, including environmental, climate, cyber, online developments indeed, drones, I see, jihadists as well, cyberspace, etc. So a lot of good ideas there. If we could see the results of the two other polls. there we had 4 little question, which was basically voting between strongly disagree and strongly agree on whether right-wing extremism is the most pressing counterterrorism challenge, leaning more towards the agreement. Left-wing extremism is less pressing than right-wing extremism, also leaning towards agreement. Counterterrorism and PV responses must be strengthened and expanded to manage right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism, also agreement there. And treating right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism similarly to religious extremism is potentially dangerous and counterproductive. Perhaps that is the one assertion that has gathered the less agreement of the 4. And finally, on the last poll, has counterterrorism reached its peak? No, everyone seems to, most people at least seem to agree with you, Christiane. So basically that means more cooperation, more coordination is still needed in this field. So thank you for everyone who has participated to these polls and questions. So again, this concludes the conversation with our panel, and we can now take some questions from the audience. And for that, I encourage you to use the question and answer tool that you will see on your window in the Zoom, and note that you can also vote for questions posed by others. But while you think and write these questions, I would like to invite you to have a look at another video presenting another member of our staff and program.
Teun van Dongen is Senior Research Fellow here at ICCT and Program Lead Current and Emerging Threats. I would like to talk to you about developments, since we're talking about current and emerging threats. Do you see research shifting to other topics in 2022?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think the best example is the anti-government sentiments and the conspiracy theories that we see go around in relation to COVID. And that's not just a new topic, but I think it also forces us to rethink the way we look at terrorism and extremism, because we tend to look at it as something that leads to violence. But I think what we're seeing with the what you could call COVID-related extremism is that it's problematic in other ways as well. And that also goes for right-wing extremism. Right? They commit terrorist attacks, and we research that. But there's a whole other aspect to it that has more to do with the way it influences discourse and thinking in the public debate, that I think is also problematic. So it also broadens our scope in looking at phenomena like extremism.
And how does your program influence other pillars?
Well, I think that it's important to have a good understanding of what a threat is like before you can start thinking of solutions. So if you want to prevent something, then you have to know what to prevent. And so that's where we come in, and in that way we lay the groundwork for some of the work that's being done in the other pillars.
And what do you hope to achieve in the next year?
I think that we want to be more present in the Dutch market. I think that we need to establish relationships with the stakeholders also operating on the local level, again, to identify all these new developments and problems that we can help them with. We're also building a network of associate fellows, people who can work with us on various topics. We're also going to engage them more in the research that we do on jihadist terrorism in Africa, for instance, or on right-wing extremism. So I think the next year will be about building networks and translating those networks into relevant research and expertise regarding our topics.
I'm looking forward to seeing more of your research then.
Well, follow us on Twitter, keep an eye on the website, because we're producing things on a very regular basis.
We'll do that. Thank you for the interview.
Well, thank you.
This was Teun van Dongen. We have now collected quite a number of questions, so thank you to everyone in the audience for being very proactive. My team has selected quite a few. And the first question that I would like to ask the panel is, it is a fact we know that counterterrorism measures, PV measures, CV measures, all of them have quite significant unintended negative consequences. So the question to all of you is, how do you think that your organization can better embrace the do no harm principle in moving forward in your agendas on CT, PV, CV? I don't want to put anyone on spot, so if you can indicate to me with a sign of a hand that you feel comfortable answering that question. Christiane, do you want to go first? Or Mr. Aalbersberg, yes.
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what we are trying to do is really have, like when we have counterterrorism projects with third countries, we do have evaluations around, like across the program, so that we already have take a lot of things like human rights into account when we set it up. I just give you an example. For some people say with certain countries we shouldn't work on CT because there are human rights issues. So my opinion would then be, or our opinion, then we should work on those issues where working on counterterrorism can help strengthen human rights, such as rule of law-based investigations, prosecutions, evidence collecting, perhaps have a discussion on, you know, what is considered terrorist, what isn't, and that's what we are doing with a number of countries. So we do try to, and then we have midterm evaluation, more periodic evaluation. So there's a lot happening in that space, that we try to take the consequences on board. And also, I'd say all the measures that we take, especially the debate on privacy and security, there are a lot of players feeding into our legislative discussions, for example. And so I think the legislative process in the EU is one where all the different consequences are highlighted and come together at the end in the compromise. And if there's still a problem, then the European Court of Justice would step in. And if that's not okay, we have to go back to the drawing board. And perhaps my last point on this would be, I strongly believe that in addition to, let's say, counterterrorism policies in the narrow sense, what we need to do a lot more is mobilize soft policies that are good in itself, let's say education, youth policy, culture, sport, and offer opportunities to young people, for example, also at risk, or young people in new communities that are less privileged, to offer positive opportunities and things which we should not label PVE, which we should not label counterterrorism. But if we do those kind of things as well, then also that could mitigate any other things. Yeah. Okay. Back to you.
Thank you, Christiane. Mr. Aalbersberg, you were second.
Yes, well, I totally agree with Christiane. Just to add some things, what I already said, as professionals, we also have to be careful is that we are not labeling new movements in terrorism or radicalization. As I said, conspiracy theories have been always, and we have to be careful not to build up every threat in the same area of that. So a good threat assessment for all our countries is very important, also to communicate with our public, to our citizens, what's happening in threat assessment, and to be very careful is that we are talking on counterterrorism, on terrorism and extremism, and not all the other areas. We have to be careful for that. Secondly, I'm still always happy that in Europe, our debates in our parliaments, our debates in the press is always a counterbalances, is that we, with new methods, not are putting all measures on each other, but also have studies which is working, which is not working. When it's nothing work, we have to stop with that and to adapt to new theories. So counterterrorism is not a kind of a building area, bigger and bigger, bigger. It's an adapting area, and it's, I think, our professionalism to keep the adapting also in the issues which are guarding. So this is not only it's a very interesting question, not only for this audience, but also for ourselves as professionals. How do we prevent labeling, or do we prevent exoneration from all the kind of methods? And this question actually should be asked every meeting always in some matters, because that keeps us sharp.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Coninsx.
Well, a very interesting question, but I think we need at least a debate of 3 hours in having a full and clear picture of the real situation. What I learned throughout the last years is that one of the difficult points is the numbers and the diversity of the terrorism extremist threat we are faced with. And that means that we cannot only refer to labels, this is terrorism, this is violent extremism, but we have to look at every single case by case. And that means that the one size fits everything would lead us to a one size fits no one. And that is a very tricky issue, because then you start to stigmatize, then you start to exclude, then you start to target persons who might not feel under that one size fits. What works in one region does not necessarily work in another one. And hence we have focused a lot on best practices harvesting, best practices on specific issues in relation to prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration, how to manage violent extremism in prisons, in countries where you have short-term convictions and in other countries. So you cannot compare everything with everything. You really have to zoom in to every single situation. And I think that phenomenon where it occurs most is in what you call extreme right wing, where we indeed saw in our dialogues in 2018, 2019, that in 31 visits, 10 countries were looking at as a big concern. We started to approach research centers, and we see that there is still a lot of gaps in the evidence-based approach. What about the gender? What about the activity? Is it online? Is it offline? What about the financing of those groups? What about the international networking? What about the use of cultural platforms? And as long as we don't have all these elements of answers, we cannot label, because if we start labeling, we will have a conflation of approaches. So it is extremely important to look at every single case separately and to avoid having labeling, because that will lead to more exclusion. And we know that exclusion is the condition per excellence leading to the spread of terrorism and violent extremism.
Thank you very much. A second question we have is with regard to the regulation of terrorist content online on the main open platforms. And the question there is whether that, whether regulating that could actually result in moving some of these discussions actually in harder to reach places on the dark web, for instance, platforms. And also a question with regard to the kind of technology solutions that have been put in place to remove terrorist content online. Because there's a number of questions out there. Perhaps I would like to ask this question more specifically to you, Christiane, because the EU and Europol notably is playing a very specific role there. So perhaps this question is really for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. A very, very relevant question. So what's, perhaps just to recap for everyone, what's the TCO, the Terrorist Content Online Regulation? It says that if the terrorist content gets flagged to a company, they have to remove it. They have to remove it quickly. They have to remove it within the hour, I think. And they also have to take some proactive measures, which, they can themselves see what kind of proactive measures that is. Now, you said, would it be harder would people go underground? Already, it would be good if there were less terrorist content on the open internet, because when do people go underground? They go underground after they have been groomed and inspired on the open internet. Then the next space is the darknet and whatever. So in that sense, that would already be very good, because there will be less exposure. So it's an important piece, but you are right, it's also not enough. It's important that companies take proactive measures, and it's also important that companies invest in content moderation in places where it's not maybe Western languages. So in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, do we have enough content moderators to be able to remove terrorist content also there and to be proactive? And there it seems that a lot of work still needs to be done, also smaller companies. So the TCO, I see it as an important building block in a broader, let's say, environment, that we all need to work on having less terrorist content online, having less grooming of the children, having less radicalization. But it's not enough in itself, but it's an important part of the whole system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question then is for Mr. Aalbersberg and Mrs. Coninsx. Given that right-wing terrorism is rising and Islamist extremism remains a big threat Do you think that reciprocal radicalization will become a bigger problem in the coming years? And how should we deal with this so-called reciprocal radicalization? Mrs. Coninsx.
Well, I think we need to follow both types of radicalization, and as we just alluded to, and I think a lot of us alluded to the rise, the peaks of terrorist attacks and activity, joining terrorist activity in specific regions, and that is coming from a jihadi perspective. That will be in need for a constant follow-up, not losing out of our sight the situation in Central Asia, Southeast Asia. And then we have another track which also asks our attention, whether in the Americas, in Europe, in the Ukraine, in specific parts of the world, and also as we've seen in Austral Asia. And that is what we label in Europe extreme right wing. Now, in what extent they will make an advantage of creating those lines of opportunities because of COVID-19, because of the online isolation, because of their miscontent, because of the chaos and the fear being created, that's something we will need to look at from a research perspective, and to be when we go in that into that lane, to be sure that it's evidence-based and that it's taken on board in our approach. I would be very, very careful and very concerned about having these conclusions and saying that they do influence each other mutually. Most probably there will be a chance. Will that be the overhand? Will that be the overhand trend? That's something we really have to be very careful with right now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Aalbersberg, briefly.
Yes, following a little bit what I already said before, is I think the process of radicalization is changing slowly, and therefore we need studying and evidence-based studying what's happening with the radicalization. It's more in structures, in organizations, in one ideology. It's much more wider, and therefore it's very important that we understand how is the development from radicalization, also in geopolitical levels. And not all radicalization is wrong. It's the radicalization which leads to the use of violence and to terrorism where we have to focus on. And therefore, those evidence-based, as Michèle said, studies, but also broader studies, how is radicalization moving and changing from nature through the internet? And then also connecting to the last questions, I'm very happy with the Content Online initiative, but we also have to build on this basic stone, as Christiane has said. These are new challenges, and radicalization is slowly moving in all those processes in between, and we have to understand that before we also start our new ideas of adapting our methods.
Thank you very much. Because we basically have reached the end of the time for this conference, I would like to ask you a last question, but basically with a yes or no answer. And basically the question is whether you expect a new wave of foreign fighters traveling to Afghanistan in light of the situation there on the ground. Christiane, yes or no? A new wave of foreign fighters mobilization?
It's something we need to watch. So far, it's not a huge wave, but we need to absolutely watch that.
Thank you. Mr. Aalbersberg?
No, because that was, I had to choose with both. And then at this moment, the answer is no.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Coninsx?
I would say yes, the risk is there.
Thank you very much. Well, at least we end up with a slight disagreement, but which is always good, a balanced and nuanced approach to this conversation. On this note, I would like to thank you very much, distinguished panelists, Dr. Hoehn, Mr. Aalbersberg, Mrs. Coninsx. It was a real pleasure to be able to count on you for this discussion. We were very glad that you accepted to join, accept our invitation and join this panel for ICCT's annual conference. I would also like to thank very much the audience, everyone that has participated actively in this discussion, asking questions, participating to the Menti, to the polls. I would also very much like to thank Huib Mijnarends and the Dutch MFA who participated in this conference, and also, and above all, perhaps the whole of the ICCT team who made this event possible. A lot of people have been working on this event. Remember that this is the first day of a 2 days event, so there is another panel, high-level academic panel tomorrow on knowledge gaps. Remember that you can also rewatch this conference on YouTube. It will be available there on ICCT's YouTube channel. And you will also receive after this an e-magazine with highlighting some of the key activities of ICCT in the past year. And finally, if you take 30 seconds at the end of this conference to fill the survey about basically whether you liked or not this event and how we can improve, this is very important for us. This is basically how we improve the quality of our events. So on this note, again, thank you everyone for participating, for joining. Join us tomorrow again, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon or end of the day, or a good day, depending on where you sit in this world. So thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.